All right, welcome back. We're going to go ahead and get started with our next speaker. So we're running a couple of minutes ahead of schedule, but we're going to take advantage of those few minutes so that we have wiggle room a little bit later in the program if needed. You may remember I was on a panel earlier. I'm Dr. Emily Kirsich, and I'll be moderating this session. I'm very excited to welcome our next speaker, who is also going to talk about the industry side of things. So Dr. Casey Vanous is going to speak to us now. She's the Senior Director of Global Product Development for Herbalife. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here today, and many thanks to the committee and also Bilal for the invitation. And it's nice to meet Emily, who's a friend of my colleague who put the slides together. So I have many people to thank for all of this. It's nice to be here because, of course, plant-based nutrition is something very near and dear to my heart. So we're going to be talking about some of the consumer demands that we have on the industry side for plant-based foods. And just some of the learning objectives of what we're going to go through and learn today. Of course, we're going to be covering the consumer eating habits and the dietary trends, looking at nutrition gaps and public health priorities, looking at opportunities that we have within product innovation, nutrition label literacy and how consumers need to be educated to look at the labels, and also talking about third-party certifications and what significance they bring to product innovation. So first, we're going to go through consumer eating habits and dietary trends. So according to the most recent survey done by IFIC, and if you're not familiar with that, that's the International Food Information Council. So just as a quick background, this is a professional organization. This information is free to the public. This is a survey that they do every year, and they're really looking at food and health on the consumer side. So sometimes if you're working at a large company, you may also have a department that does consumer insight research. But if not, this is a tool that you could leverage to figure out what is it that consumers are looking for, right? And so they do this survey every year, and it's available on their website. So what do we know based on the latest survey, right? More people are following a specific pattern or diet compared to 5 years ago. And the ones that we see most commonly right now reported are high protein and mindful eating. And the folks that we see selecting these dietary patterns include Gen Z, millennials, and also individuals that have higher income. They're more likely to follow a specific eating pattern. So when we think of something like a plant-based diet, because this is another dietary pattern that's obviously very popular, there's no consensus on how it's defined. And we heard earlier from a speaker about this, right? It could include vegan, Mediterranean, flexitarian, vegetarian diets, right? So typically when we think of plant-based, we assume that folks are eating more fruits, more vegetables, nuts, seeds, whole grains, and legumes, right? But there's not a specific ratio that would qualify you to be plant-based. So there's some perception or interpretation that's very individual under this umbrella. And when we look at motivations for why people want to have a plant-based diet, we see that they typically aspire to be healthier, right? And so if we think of the data that we saw, well, that's probably legitimate, right? We're seeing that there's reduced risk when you have a dietary pattern that is plant-based like that. But it might be that they also enjoy these foods more. They might be thinking of animals, and they don't want to participate in anything that's happening to an animal, so that's part of why they choose what they eat. It could be for the environment, and sometimes it's even they're influenced by their family and friends who are following these types of diets. Perhaps a doctor or a dietitian recommended this type of eating to address a specific health condition as well. So there are a myriad of reasons why people would select this, but the one that we see is most common is that really they want to be healthier. So what else are we learning about people? Well, they want to be healthier. They're snacking a lot too, right? So I'm guilty of it. I have children at home. My husband will say, we never snacked growing up. And I say, we didn't either, but that's kind of how we survive these days, right? Everything's on the go. So we know that snacking is becoming more popular. 73% of the people surveyed, and the survey is for Americans, so that's the context behind this. 73% of people are snacking at least once a day. and people are actually replacing meals with snacks. So when we think in terms of the industry side, where could we innovate here? This is a great opportunity to create something that is very nutrient dense, right? And we're going to talk about nutrient density in a little bit, but this is a place where if you can come up with something innovative in that space, that is a great solution to make sure that those snacks are meaningful. Now, when we think of people wanting to eat a plant-based diet and they're thinking they want to be healthier, well, what does healthy mean to you, right? It could mean fresh, right? These are things that people report. It's fresh. Oh, it's a good source of protein, and it's low in sugar, right? These are some of the top things that they're saying. Right now, I believe the regulatory claim healthy is currently being revised, so it's not necessarily going to line up with everyone's perception, but this is what people are thinking of when they're going after that healthy part. Now, when we look at okay, this is what you want, right? But what drives your purchase decision? So we see that taste is king. That's what my old advisor used to say. Taste is king, right? It better taste good. And we see over time, taste stays at the top, right? After that, it's price. So people want something that tastes good and it's affordable, right? It's accessible for them. And to meeting those two criteria is very important. Those are continuing to be the top two drivers for what they're going to buy. Now, we see healthfulness is a very strong third place here, which is interesting because people said they wanted a plant-based diet so they could be more healthy, but apparently that's only if it tastes really good and it is cost affordable. So it's in a strong third place there. Of course, convenience we know because everyone's on the go, and then the last one is sustainability. So it seems like it's still a very important factor. It's in the top 5, but it maybe isn't as prominent driving their purchase decision right now as it has been necessarily in former times. So now we know what consumers want. We know what they're doing, right? And so now we have to figure out, like, what do they need? What are they missing, right? So we think about nutrition gaps and some public health priorities. So the most recent dietary guidelines for Americans, which we're going to be having a new version come out soon, right? Some of the obvious things, right? Americans aren't eating enough fiber. We need more fiber. We need more calcium. Vitamin D is one that continues to remain a nutrient that we want to encourage, as well as potassium. And then, of course, it's no surprise we've got to reduce that intake of added sugar, of sodium, of saturated fats, right? I don't think this is news to any of us. When we think of life-stage considerations, there are also very select nutrients that are important too. When we think of something like folate, now we know that methylfolate is really the ideal form of folate because some women can't convert folate to methylfolate, right, because of a genetic polymorphism. So now we have to make sure they have their folate before they're pregnant and during pregnancy so that they'll reduce their risk for neural tube defects. Something like iodine is important as well, right? You have to support thyroid function and make sure that the pregnancy is sustained. Things like choline and omega-3 fatty acids are very important, but then again, for the omega-3s, we have to make sure if they're eating seafood, they don't get too much mercury. So it's a balancing act, and some of these you might see available in a supplement form simply because you can control usually the level of contaminants in a supplement, so it removes that part of the risk. When we think of older adults, we know that protein may not be as easy to get as you get older. Folks aren't eating as much, right? They usually have less absorption and utilization of protein, so we have to be very deliberate about making sure that protein is meeting their needs, as well as vitamin B12. So vitamin B12 is very common in animal products, so that is something that's routinely supplemented for vegans and vegetarians, and also because absorption goes down with age, that's another one that you will find is a common supplement for older adults. Well, so it's no surprise we're not eating the way that we should, right? And we have a lot of chronic disease, and 5 of the 10 leading causes of death are actually preventable or treatable, usually with a healthy, active lifestyle and proper nutrition, right? And we know that chronic disease prevalence has been increasing steadily for 20 years. So we have a lot of knowledge, but we haven't seemed to be able to kind of move beyond these risks that we see. So when we look at the map of the US, we see, 1 in 5 adults has obesity. So that's not even overweight, that's obesity. And I'm surprised there's even a state that's left in green anymore at the rate that we're going. Diabetes is another one that's on the rise. So we know we have a lot of health risks and health conditions that could actually benefit from folks embracing more of a plant-based lifestyle. And we did talk about sustainability a little bit. It is still an important factor in consumer behavior, even if it's not the top one. So when people think about sustainability again, what are they thinking about? They want to know, is this food available for me in a local market? Is it bioengineered? Is it GMO, non-GMO, right? Were they being kind to animals, or were animals involved in any of this when they were producing the food? What about the employees working on the food? How were they treated? There's a lot of expectations that consumers have when they're thinking about sustainability. So these are all things, again, when you understand how the consumer is thinking and behaving, you can understand how to put together a solution that will meet those needs or desires. One of our speakers this morning actually went through the FAO definition on sustainability, so I won't go through that one here, but it is in the slides if those get shared. So this kind of moves us into product innovation and opportunities. So where is the opportunity? When we think of plant-based, it's still, even though it doesn't have a regulatory definition, right, it's still in the news. It's there for exercise performance. I think someone's going to speak later today on plant-based protein and exercise performance. How is it for health? How is it for disease? Is it something that can offer more sustainability, right? It's a very hot topic that spans many areas. So as you're well aware, because we're hearing from some of the other speakers as well. So when we think about putting a product together, we think of what factors do we need to consider when we're designing this, right? Of course, we know there are nutrients that we want to include in these products. We call them the encouraged nutrients. Which are the ones that we want to put in? And then what's on the no list, or what we want to avoid or limit, right? Those are things that we want to make sure that we don't put in our products, or we use only the minimal amount as we have to achieve whatever the desired effect is. And then there's the format, right? Can I put it in a nugget? Will it be a protein powder? Is it going to be in a bar, something like an omega-3? Let's say I have algae omega-3s. I want to put them in a product. Maybe I can put them in a bar, but they might work better in a soft gel, right? Sometimes when you have a very strong flavor, you might have to be very clever about the format that you put it in so that the sensory part doesn't stop someone from wanting to consume it, because we know taste is king, right? So beyond that, who are you going to market your product to, right? You can design it to meet their needs and wants as well. Cost and taste, I think we've covered those. Sustainability, those are parts of, where do you want to fold that into the product that you're building? So when you can assemble all the different targets that you want to hit, then you can identify, what does my successful product architecture look like for a plant-based product? When we think of plant-based proteins, we have many sources, right? We're typically thinking, what has adequate protein that I can utilize as a plant-based protein source, and how is the protein quality that comes from that source? So we think of things like legumes and seeds, and hearing earlier about the upcycled opportunities. Hey, maybe the oil seeds are becoming more popular because we maybe press the oil out of those seeds, but the spent material has protein in it that we could harness and use within plant-based protein innovation, right? Cereals, pseudo-cereals, nuts, tubers, these are all things that have protein constituents that can be leveraged when you're building your plant-based protein product. So when we think about plant-based proteins, most plant proteins have a PD-Cas of less than 1. So we're going to go through PD-Cas in a few slides, but essentially a PD-Cas of 1 means that a protein offers all of the essential amino acids at the amounts that are needed for human nutrition, right? So typically soy is the only plant protein to date that has a PD-Cas of 1. So it has all those essential amino acids in amounts that are useful for human health. So it's complete, it's high quality, right? Most of the other plant-based proteins, you have to be a little bit clever and blend them together to achieve the desired protein quality in your finished product. And it's not as easy as just mixing the two. Hey, on paper, this one has these amino acids and this has this, and we're going to put them together, and now we have a full protein quality. There are other physical properties that come with those plant-based proteins that you have to consider, including, solubility. Does it have water holding capacity? Can I emulsify it? Is it going to foam, right? Does it gel? What's the molecular weight? These are all things that you have to consider when you're putting these plant-based proteins together. Now, processing, even though it might not be something that you want to include in your product, can actually really help, because when you can leverage processing to really optimize the physical properties to deliver the experience and the nutrition that you want for your consumer. So this really requires careful selection and testing in order to put together a plant-based protein that has the desired attributes. Another thing that we think about too, also thinking in the back of our minds about processing, right, is nutrient density. So nutrient density is really this idea of, for this example here, hey, I have my budget is 140 calories, so where do I want to spend it? Do I want to spend it on a handful of jelly beans, right, where I have a lot of energy density? Or do I want to spend it on these fresh fruits that look so yummy on the left-hand side and get a lot of nutrients? I can get my fiber, I can get micronutrients, polyphenols, right, antioxidants, and it's the same energy spend either way, but what you're seeing on the left-hand side is really something that we would consider as very nutrient dense, right? So Adam Jernowski has done a lot of research in this area with nutrient density, and what they're really talking about is the ratio of the nutrient composition of a food to the nutrient requirements of the human. So USDA also has a definition for nutrient density, and it's really focused on those whole foods, right? Like including vegetables, fruits, whole grains, seafood, eggs, beans and peas, unsalted nuts and seeds, fat-free and low-fat dairy products, lean meats, and poultry, and avoiding saturated fat, sodium, and added sugars. So the ones that we see we need to eat less of. So this is really, nutrient profiling is actually the tool that they use to identify these foods that contain a spectrum of key essential nutrients, typically the nutrients that you want to encourage, and then they limit those negative nutrients. So we see that ultra-processed food can be lumped kind of everything together sometimes, and they're viewed very negatively towards health, primarily due to poor nutrient density, but that may or may not be related to the degree of processing. And this is really important because processing can enhance the nutritional profile of your food, or it can kind of leave it untouched and just change the physical properties. But you can have something that is ultra-processed that is still very nutrient-dense, right? So when we think of ultra-processed food and we just automatically assume this is not nutritious or not healthy, it's actually not evidence-based, right? Because something that would consider the nutrient density of that food is more appropriate way to look at the food holistically and its contributions to human health. So another area, of course, sugar and sweeteners. So remember, folks want things that taste really good, but we have to cut back on added sugar. So it's pretty common to see in product innovation that folks are using non-nutritive sweeteners to reduce that sugar intake, right? And you can see some of the common substitutes up here. So this is very interesting because some of these will be considered natural depending on where you go around the globe. Oh, if this has anything down in Mexico, you're going to have a black label and it's not for children because it has a sweetener. But you can go into Asia Pacific and stevia is fine, but not your sucralose or whatever. So there are even regulatory things that you'll need to consider when you're coming up with your food about how do consumers perceive these, how do regulatory bodies look at these types of sweeteners. And then typically when you use these types of sweeteners, sugar actually acts as a bulking agent when in food, right? So if you're moving to a non-nutritive sweetener, you now have to figure out how do I get that same performance of sugar in my food that will bulk it up, or if it's in a bar, like how do I make it soft and chewy, right, without sugar? So you have to be creative, and some of the things that you can do are use sugar alcohols or other things together with these sweeteners to kind of give that desired experience to the consumer. So in general, I know they may not always be popular, but they are generally considered safe, and due to how they behave differently, really, you have to typically look at combinations to optimize the flavor experience, because some may be more heat stable than others, some may be sweet very much at the beginning and not have a long sweetness duration. So you have to look at, how's my product going to be consumed, how do I want the sweetness profile to be in that product. So these are really things where you can play around and figure out what gives the consumer the best sensory experience. Well, we're trying to avoid sugar, right? So now sodium is another one that we want to be very careful about. And I think someone was talking earlier about palates, right? We got to slowly train our palates to kind of back off on salt and sugar and other things. So when we look at sodium intake, right, the sodium intake is associated with risk for high blood pressure, with heart disease and stroke, right? And this is if you have a high intake of sodium and or if you have an insufficient take of potassium. So we know that average salt intake is high. This is a global number. 9 to 12 grams a day seems so high to me, but apparently that is something that is happening around the globe. So there's been this agreement that we really want to reduce this global intake of salt by a relative 30% by 2025. So this is something that could prevent deaths, so that's wonderful. 2025 is next year, so I'm very curious to see if they do any surveys and if we've achieved that number or not. So stay tuned for more information there. But in the meantime, you can decide to reduce salt in your product, and there are some strategies that you can incorporate to help reduce the salt. So there are things that you can use like salt substitutes, right? You can use herbs and spices, and they'll give kind of novel flavors and new sensory sensations. And sometimes you can even use antagonistic and synergistic effects. So something like an acid flavor is going to enhance the perception of salt at low concentrations. And then, of course, you can, again, take processing. You can do spray drying, other forms of drying, ultrasound, to really change the size and structure of common salt. So even if you have the same content, the surface area is different, so the sensory experience, it could be optimized. So reading nutrition labels, all this is well and good, but if you don't know how to read a nutrition label and you're after health, you may not be able to really make an informed decision about which product that you want to purchase. So we know folks seeking healthy diet or being more healthy are the ones that may go after the plant-based diet, right? It's very appealing to them. So the nutrition label is very important to that population so that they can look at products side by side and figure out which one is more healthy, right? And for protein specifically, the percent daily value is really the one that offers the insight on protein quality. So when we look at protein, most nutrition labels don't need to display the percent daily value. They can just display it has this many grams of protein in the nutrition facts panel. But if you're making a protein quality claim like good source of protein, high in protein, excellent source, packed with protein, any of those kind of implied nutrient content claims, the percent daily value needs to be disclosed on the label. So, and in order to calculate the percent daily value, the PDCAS is used. So PDCAS is the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score. So what it means essentially is if you have your essential amino acids, let's say your protein source has 90% of the essential amino acids that are needed for human health, but it's only 50% absorbable, like digestible, right? When they've done the studies to say it's only 50% digestible, then that PDCAS is 45%, right? Or 0.45. So so what it does is it's taking into account how digestible is the protein, so how many of those essential amino acids are liberated for absorption. So when you have PDCAS of 1, it means it's 100% complete, even after digestion, and anything that is less than 1 is considered an incomplete protein. So as we mentioned before, the plant-based proteins don't contain the essential amino acids in sufficient amounts except for soy, of course. So this is a good example of how to read the nutrition label. So To calculate the percent DV of protein, well, we know that the daily value of protein is 50 grams, right? That's how products are labeled in the US. So we know when we look, these look very similar, right? These look like protein powders. I would have my guess of which one is on the left and what's on the right, but I'm not going to say it here. So calories are pretty similar. We see a little more fat in the one on the right, so we're not surprised it has a little bit more calorie content. But both of these products have 20 grams of protein. So 20 grams out of 50 grams, I'm doing math with my sixth grader every night. I know that's 40%, right? So that is a complete protein, we know, because it's got a 40% DV. But we look over here, it's 20 grams of protein, but the percent daily value is only 28. So what happened, right? This is a clue that this protein is not complete. So when we look at this protein, we know the PD-Cas is a 0.7, right? And that's why the percent daily value is less than we would expect for something that's complete. So, you know, consumers typically have areas that they're going to look at on the nutrition facts panel, but they may not be educated to look holistically at the whole label and figure out how are these different. They might just be going to a part that's of interest to them, right? Like my mom would choose the one on the right because she's 84 years old and she's an elite athlete, you know, around the world. She's a champion sprinter, but she has hemochromatosis and she's a vegan. So we always wonder, where are you getting all this iron in your diet? Well, she takes plant-based protein supplements, and so she's going to avoid this one because it has iron. She might pick that one, right? But really, consumers need to be looking at the whole facts panel together, right? And that's definitely an area for education opportunity. So third-party certifications. Let's say you've done all your due diligence and you have your product and you want to bring it to the market, but you want to make sure that people realize this is a legitimate product. This has science legs, it has safety, it's quality, it's clean, right? I'm ready to go to market and I want to make sure that everyone else knows this is a credible product. So what is a third-party certification? This is something that you can have done for your product. It's a certification where they do an objective evaluation and they verify your food or your dietary supplement through an independent third party, and this third party must have no business interest in the company that makes the product. So there are a lot of pros, right? Like these types of third-party certifications can confirm that your product is safe. They can verify the potency and the ingredients that are in your product, which is really good for building consumer trust and brand credibility. It can reduce your risk that something was in your product that you didn't even know to test for, right? And so it can give you a competitive advantage too, because if they see your product on the shelf with a certification and a similar product without it, they might want to pick something that has been vetted objectively. Some of the cons are, of course, it's going to cost you a little bit of money, and sometimes it might take some time, so you might need to delay the launch of your product. And of course, depending on what body you pick, there can be variable quality, meaning what's important to one organization and what they look at is different from another one. So a couple that are familiar to me that come to mind are listed up here. We have the Food Chain ID and Vegan Plant-Based Certification. So this is a company that's going to make sure that all your food truly is vegan and plant-based. Going through one of these exercises recently, I learned that in order to be certified this way, there has to also be the component that the ingredients were not tested on animals. So it's not even the absence of animal-based ingredients or animal-derived ingredients, but it's also behaviors, practices, and things that were done with that ingredient. There's USDA organic, so meaning this food has been produced in compliance with their standard, and it's minimum 95% organic, non-GMO verified. Okay, we would, obviously you know what that is, right? And traceability is an important part of that, which we see a lot of in Europe as well. There's NSF certified for sport, so for this particular certification, they're going to make sure that your product doesn't contain any of the 290 substances that are on the WADA, the World Anti-Doping Association list, right? So those are absent. It doesn't have any contaminants that would be harmful to human health, those types of things, that your facility is is GMP certified, and they're going in to do their audits as well. And then you have USP, where they're really going to focus on verifying that you have the right ingredients that you put on your label and your ingredient deck, they're at the right potency, and then one of the things that they bring that's unique is that it dissolves, so meaning it has to dissolve in a certain amount of time so that theoretically you can absorb it if you eat it. So depending on which part that you think is the strength of your product or how you design your product, you could pick a third party to certify it. And I know more retailers are requiring this as well. So I would be remiss not to mention heavy metals, like the ugly secret of the plant-based eating world. So these are things that are abundant in plant foods. They just are, because the plants absorb heavy metals from the soil. So if any of you don't live in California, but you've come to visit us here, welcome. I'm sure that you learned that the parking garage is going to give you cancer, as well as your coffee, and your morning pastry has acrylamide. So there's just threats everywhere, so watch out, right? So this is a California regulation that's really based on notifying consumers. So for these particular things, the threshold that you have to notify consumer is not the threshold that is considered there's a safety issue, right? It is below that. So these are things that we commonly see. You might see if you purchase products here, and if you're a plant-based product, you go to Whole Foods or wherever you're going to shop and buy your Sprouts and buy your product off the shelf. You may see a warning like, I'm in the health aisle and buying my plant-based protein. I'm going to change this way of eating so I can be healthy. And there's a warning on my plant-based product. What is this, right? And you'll see, I just didn't disclose the company, but you'll see the regulation here, you have to specify the actual substance that's in that product that is so egregious, right? So you'll say this one has lead, maybe another one has cadmium or arsenic. So you'll see that there, but it's something to really, was intended to notify consumers. So the interesting part of this is that those heavy metals are also lurking in your fruit and vegetable aisle, but you will never hear about it because they're not required to label. So we don't know how much is present in the fresh whole foods as well. So it's just something I like to flag, because we think of plant-based eating as so healthy, and it is, right? We know it is, and the science shows us it has impact on human health. But these are things that could be confusing to consumers because they're not seeing it on their lettuce and their peppers and whatever they're buying at the market, but they'll see it when they go to the store to buy their supplement. So there are some ways that you can get exemptions, but it's a very difficult, I mean, you have to go into how the plant is harvested, defining what's naturally occurring. There's just a lot that's involved in that. So it's really something that is, you want to be aware of if you're making a product and you intend to sell it in California, because it is something that you'll face. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. So.
There was a lot of emphasis in your talk on protein quality, because I see consumers are comparing plant-based foods to animal-based foods, be it whey protein or meat or whatever, right? So historically, soy protein has really only been that complete PDCAS protein that's out there. But then there's allergen considerations or phytoestrogens, and people are kind of afraid of using soy in some cases. So do you see a lot of kind of like open space in the consumer landscape for other vegan proteins that do have a PDCAS one, whether that's a blend or like an alternative like soy, or if you can make a quinoa protein or something else like that?
Absolutely, we do, and we also, because because of the allergenicity of soy, right, we see a lot of interest in pea protein is the one that kind of comes in second place a lot, because its PDCAS is usually 0.7 to 0.8, so it's pretty high for a plant-based protein, because we typically think of vegetarian diet, right? We were always taught to combine foods, combine your rice and your beans, and you'll get a complete protein, right? Pea is very high on the list, so you'll see those pea proteins a lot. That could have been the product that was on the right that we saw the label for, and they just didn't blend it with anything. They took a straight pea protein. But absolutely, I think there's a desire to move outside of soy and get into other plant-based protein blends. And I mean, I see products where they're touting, we have this tri-blend or these 4 ingredients that we blend to give you this complete protein, right? And I think that's something that has resonated with consumers for sure.
One quick follow-on to that. If you could get a single source that has a PDCAS1 that's vegan, is that a significant differentiating factor in the landscape of a consumer?
I would think, so I'm a scientist, so I can't speak on behalf of the consumer, but I would think that it would be, because it makes it simpler on when you're building your formula too, right? Because folks typically don't want to see a lot of ingredients on the ingredient list. That's just the bottom line. They don't want to, right? But something like plant proteins, they may be okay with it, but if it's a simple clean, that is something that resonates with consumers too, and it would always be, to me, there's an exciting new development if we have a product that's a complete protein plant-based that isn't soy. There's nothing else besides soy right now. Okay. I'm sure I'll be hearing from you. Thank you.
What are your thoughts about hemp protein? Is that a natural protein?
Is it natural?
Yeah, hemp seed flour, they sell at Costco or someplace, yeah, you know.
I love to tell you there's actually no regulatory definition for natural, so I would only be opining on that. But I think most of the proteins that are derived from things that grow out of the earth, consumers typically perceive as natural, right? It's just like people perceive stevia as natural, but if you work with stevia in the industry, you'll see that how do they get the sweetness parts of the stevia plant? They use methanol and ethanol and all these things, right? So there's a disconnect sometimes even between what happens on one side and what consumers think on the other side. But as far as hemp protein, I think that's something that we hear about and we see. It's something that we're familiar with and comfortable with, so.
Thanks. First of all, I thought your talk was amazing. It was so chock full of useful information. It was really, really incredible.
Very kind.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering if there are things we can learn from any other countries in terms of labeling or simplicity, or if there are certification entities anywhere else that just make it a lot easier for a consumer, because it's so difficult, right? And in some ways, it would be wonderful if you had someone curate it for you and just say, this is good, eat this, and this is bad, you know, even just that simple, right? So is there any other country that's doing better on any aspect?
On educating consumers, you mean?
Making it simple, or doing anything that we can learn from?
My old boss used to say, there's a lot of regulatory mischief going on, right? And we do see it all the time. So I come from industry, right? So we sell products in 95 markets, and I say that only to say that we see everyone's operating kind of under their own umbrella. In terms of making things simple, I feel like we continue to have these regulations that go like this, where we're making things more complicated, right? So I don't see right now like spotting something where this part is simple. I think you see, like in Europe, what was being talked about earlier is kind of this precautionary principle. Like if there's any safety risk, it doesn't matter if it's 100 times the amount that we would have in our product, like someone have to eat 100 servings of our product every day to encounter a safety risk, we're still gonna put a label on it, right? We're gonna say this is unsafe, or we're gonna ban this ingredient. So, you know, in that sense, you're gonna avoid all risk, right? So it's like they don't take a risk-based approach. They just have a zero tolerance for risk, right? And I work with toxicologists and know that they'll say the dose makes the poison, right? Even I can guzzle some water up here if I have a big enough thing, and that's it. Take me to the ER because I'm a goner, right? So there is this element of exposure that they don't consider when they're looking at precautionary principles. So I would say I haven't seen it yet. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but maybe it's just in a market that we haven't touched, right? So
Thank you.
if we see it, we want to copy it for sure, right?
Yeah.
More questions?
I do have a question for you. I am curious how you're handling this big pseudo influencer world of avoiding seed oils, especially with the high use of soy. Do you guys have any messaging that you've been putting out, or any research that you'd be able to share that we can then share with consumers, or have you not had much questioning maybe because you're not using the oil, but you're using the,
We
yeah.
do use some seed oils. I'm really glad you brought that up because there's something else I want to talk about too. So for the seed oils, I'm confident that we have information that we could share, right? I mean, we have toxicologists on staff and folks that look at these types of things, and you know, we want to make sure first our products are safe, period, right? I think it's hard because influencers may not, they may be an influencer, but they don't have the credentials that folks in the room here have, legitimate scientists, and so their opinion gets put forth as evidence when it's not, right? So we do combat that, and we have folks that can translate the science into something that a consumer could understand. The other thing that I wanted to say is that when I was in undergrad, I realized we don't do a good job, and maybe it's better now. Bilal, you know, the folks who have organized all this, it sounds like they probably do a better job now of kind of bringing more transparency around the opportunities that there are. You know, we back when I was in school, it was like you go into academia or that's it. Those are the only opportunities that you have. But I can tell you, you know, we have like hundreds of scientists at the company and you know, tens of doctoral level people, and there are opportunities. The industry wants to bring people in who can think critically and tell, we should avoid this, we should use this, right? So we have those folks in the staff looking at these things. We're never gonna, you know, safety is the thing we have to make sure that we have. We're gonna be combating the influencers. Typically what we see is it's a spike and then it falls off and they're on to the next thing, right? So the trends are something that it's like you mostly have to field that, but if you have done your substantiation, then you're fine, right? So. And we've learned a lot from Mark Messina. Probably people here know who he is, right? I mean, we've done a lot of work with him too, and Alison Duncan up in University of Guelph about getting information on soy safety, and they're really, I mean, knowledgeable.
People were then translating it to even soy protein isolate. You know, how sometimes they can translate it. Sometimes the information can be translated so inaccurately. For example, I did a presentation for cancer survivors, and because they knew there was a higher risk of colon cancer with higher red meat consumption, they somehow translated that to think that they also needed to avoid dairy because it came from a cow. And
Yeah.
it's like, I personally, as the scientist and dietitian, would never have done that, connection. So I just had to explain, well, no, we actually don't have any evidence there to suggest that the dairy would increase your risk of the colon cancer. So I was curious if anybody had connected this seed oil ban. And for those of you who don't know, this is something that is a hot trend in the nutrition world that I call the quasi-nutrition science, where they think seed oils are bad, and it's not. But one influencer takes the stage and takes over, and then misconceptions occur. So I was just curious if it had ever gotten translated into soy protein isolate, and I'm so glad it's not.
Yeah, I haven't heard of it. Doesn't mean it didn't somewhere, but.
Yeah, it's a very nice presentation, first of all. Thank you. I just want to add experience in that. In maybe 20 years ago, I was in USDA Manhattan. There was a big hype about acrylamide. Mm-hmm. When you bake products or fry French fries, there is acrylamide, and there is huge conferences about it in AACC, which is Cereal Chemistry Conference, and we were writing grants on that and but the hype went down, because the instrumentation available now can detect up to parts per billion, which is way below the actual threshold for health purposes. So equipment has changed what we can detect, but it doesn't mean it is unhealthy. So I want to just add to that this is something we have to be careful when we say this present, lead is present, or acrylamide is present, or something like that.
Yeah.
So it should be very consciously done when we get some information from anywhere. Yeah,
it is. Context is very important. Nuance is important, right? So I can say, there's lead in your plant protein. Everyone's going to be, right? It's like they took it out of gas, but they're letting you eat it. But the bottom line is like okay, there's less lead in there than there is in your lettuce, right? I'm making this up just for like a depiction, but you know what I'm saying? Like the context is the important part. So, yeah.
There is a high, they advertise in a Trader Joe's store here in California. Tempeh has the highest amount of protein. It's a grain which is, I think, fermented grain. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, and what's your thoughts on that?
On tempeh? I don't know much about tempeh. I learned about it in food science class, but it's my understanding it's soybean that's fermented with a rhizopus mold, right, and pressed into a cake. I have people nodding, so I think you might have some experts in the room who may know more than that rudimentary knowledge that I can offer. So it tastes good.
Yeah, it's very yummy.
Oh, thank you. So I would ditto what everyone else said about the presentation. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
But I'm going to piggyback on a question that came up around the influencers. And I would say, from my perspective, I think part of what's happening, there's a big gap. There's a trust factor, number one, right? And so I think many of the influencers are filling that gap. There's a gap of information, right? So as someone who's been vegan for nearly 20 years, I find myself becoming a chemist. You know, because I can't trust necessarily, or there's a feeling of lack of trust. The information on the back of the food gets changed all the time, and there doesn't seem to be a community-based or consumer-based organization out there that will tell you the truth or tell you what you should be eating. And so you've got these chemists in their kitchen. You know, I'm cooking tempeh, I'm making tempeh, I'm doing all of these things. And so my question would be, do you see that there is a community or an advocacy collaboration that exists, or where do folks that want to know more, that are grasping for more, how do we get educated?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wouldn't be surprised if there are consumer advocacy groups or groups that look at food products and give their grading and qualities, but again, how legitimate are they, right? That would be something I would have to look into because I'm not familiar with any of those, but definitely there would be a need. So that's a very good question. I'll have to look into that one and see.
I think we've technically reached the end of our time, and I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. I'm going to take a moment to thank you again for this great talk. I also want to remind all of our attendees that there are surveys where you can give us some feedback about the presentations that you're watching. So I'm just going to remind you that that's there. Please take a break, but I want to make sure that you set a timer and come back, be here by 3:30. We still have two really fantastic speakers to end out our day. Thank you.